What's your impression of the strategy being employed here? Is the goal to actually have an interview? Is the president really pushing them to find a way to do that? Or are they playing for time, maybe, giving them more opportunity to go after Robert Mueller and damage his reputation ahead of whenever it is that he releases his findings?
I think Peter is exactly right. The way he laid this out is really a public stalling game by the president's two attorneys, both of whom were really brought in to play this out in the public, to be the TV lawyers. Jay Sekulow talking about this on his own radio show. I mean, this is all meant for public consumption. It's true that the president himself is ambivalent about this. Yes, part of his self-creation myth is his ability to convince anyone of anything in the room. But the other side of that, the other part of his character, his pathology, is the sense of grievance, the fact that he's being treated unfairly. And he also views this entire thing, as he tells us almost daily on Twitter, as a witch hunt. And so his sense of grievance, his activated sense that he's being attacked.
Let me stop you there, because it raises an interesting question for me. If the president really does believe, and I think most folks do buy into this, he believes he can convince anybody of anything. It's why, right? He went to sit down with leaders of authoritarian countries because he thought he could change the equation just by a face-to-face meeting. Are his lawyers worried? Are the people around him who don't want him to talk to Mueller worried that in a split moment he could agree to something just because that part of his personality becomes dominant?
Yes, well, the dominant part of his personality that worries his attorneys the most is his ability, or his tendency to really stretch the truth. And that's putting it nicely. I mean, this is a person who has great economic data, who has to go further and say that it's the best and record-setting economic data. This is a guy who sold his Trump Tower building by saying it was 10 stories higher than it actually was, who determines his self-worth based on how he feels. And so when they talk about perjury traps, you don't get trapped into perjury. And that is, again, that's rhetoric meant for the public to believe the idea that somehow they're trying to trick Donald Trump. No one has to trick or dupe this president when it comes to getting him to stretch the truth, to go beyond the truth. The difference here is that the stakes for the president, for his family, for his associates, the legal stakes are much higher than anywhere else. And I think even though the president may have this belief in his ability to go in and set things straight in person, his attorneys and the people around him are really concerned about him doing that.
All right, so let me go back to the special counsel and play part of what Rudy Giuliani had to say on Fox News. Take a listen.
He knows the answers to every question that he wants to ask. He's going to ask him, did you tell Comey to go easy on Flynn? The president's going to say, no, I didn't. Hey, Bob, you know it. Why do you want to get him under oath? You think we're fools? You want to get him under oath because you want to trap him into perjury. Well, we're not going to let you do that.
Ned, so what does Robert Mueller want from President Trump?
Well, in this case, Chris, Bob Mueller wants to know what exactly President Trump was thinking when he said these things. I don't think there's any dispute about at least the thrust of what was said. We've heard from Jim Comey under oath before Congress, and Mueller has heard the same thing, presumably, from Comey and his team about what exactly President Trump said. What Bob Mueller and his team want to know is what exactly was going through Trump's head. Was there some sort of criminal intent when he said these things to Jim Comey about Michael Flynn, when he was interacting with others that are central to this obstruction investigation, unless there is a smoking gun email that is written by President Trump that seems to convey his deepest, innermost thoughts, that says, when I told Jim Comey to let this Flynn thing go, I was trying to obstruct justice. I don't think the Mueller team is going to be satisfied, because that's precisely what they're looking for. They need to go beyond exactly what was said to determine exactly what he was thinking.
So, AB, let me go back to this whole idea of President Trump and what he wants and what's likely to happen here. This whole idea that he simply has to get somebody in a room and he can convince them of anything. Where does that take him in terms of the Robert Mueller investigation?
Well, I think what Eli was laying out is that there's just two things. That is true, that he does believe, as you said, if it's Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin, if it gets somebody alone, he's going to get his way. He's going to convince them of his truth. The other thing is, not only does he lie a lot, sometimes he tells the truth. Like to your own Lester Holt of NBC News when he said, I was thinking about this Russia thing. I was going to fire him anyway. His lawyers are afraid not only he might lie under
Interesting
oath,
point is that,
but that he might just give away the store.
The bigger danger is that he might tell the
It just
truth.
depends on the minute, right? And so sometimes he does reveal himself. What Ned is speaking to, which is so confusing about obstruction of justice, is it seems to be in the eye of the beholder. I'm not a lawyer, and I can't determine what ultimately is proof you were trying to derail a probe and you had corrupt intent. That's up to Mueller. But it's what Rudy and Jay Sekulow are trying to lay out is that you can't obstruct by tweet. If you obstruct, it has to be in the dark of night, it has to be covert. You could never, you're not just doing it on Twitter. That's just your passing thoughts. That's not an actual act of criminal obstruction. So that's what they're campaigning against, the whole obstruction idea anyway, is that if it's out in the open, it was just fine.
Yeah, speaking of Twitter, the president shockingly tweeted this. This is the most one-sided witch hunt in the history of our country. Fortunately, the facts are all coming out, and facts. I mean, Ben, the truth is we haven't heard anything from Robert Mueller. That has been about as tight an operation as you can possibly get. So what facts might he be referring to?
I have no idea. He makes up his own facts whenever he wants. But I do think the point that AB makes is the most important one. I mean, Trump went on national TV, on NBC News, and basically, to a lot of people, admitted obstruction of justice, that he had the Mueller probe in mind when he fired the director of the FBI. So my view has always been that Trump's lawyers will never, ever let him sit down with Robert Mueller and testify, no matter what he wants. And he may want one day to clear his name and have this interview, the next day feel nervous about it and think he's going to trip himself up. But I've never believed that they would allow him to sit down with Mueller and potentially contradict himself, perjure himself, go off on some tangent in which he admits to things that nobody even knows about at this point. It's just, there's way too much risk involved in that for them. So they are delaying. They do want to get it closer to the midterm elections, at which point he couldn't issue a subpoena because they'll be in this quiet period. So I think they want to take it to close to November, not get a subpoena fight until after the midterms. And then I think you would cataclysmic legal battle.
Ned, is that how you see this? Because, I think Mueller has, three choices. He can keep negotiation, he can stop negotiating and go on without an interview, or he can issue a subpoena.
Well, that's exactly right. I think on the part of Rudy Giuliani, this is classic Rudy in the sense that he's saying one thing and doing another thing entirely. He and his team have been saying for months now, some 9 months, that they want to wrap this thing up. Remember, this was supposed to be concluded by Christmas of 2017, Christmas of last year. We're now in August. But I think they've actually reached the point where they've developed a new strategy. And their strategy now is to say they want to get this wrapped up, say they want to get this over with, but actually to extend it, to make it longer, because they have found that it's actually a winning issue with Trump's base. They can portray this thing as a witch hunt. They can galvanize Trump's most ardent supporters and actually use this to bring them out, to energize them, to make them think, to dupe them into thinking that the government, that's some sort of deep state cabal.
So the midterm strategy in congressional races is save the president?
Well, it certainly seems to be a winning issue for them, or at least they think it's one. This is one that I think they actually want to see continue through the fall so that they can use this. And I do agree that I think the most likely subpoena option is likely to come after the midterms, not before. I don't think that the special prosecutor's office would risk that cataclysmic constitutional showdown in the midst of the election season, knowing precisely what Jim Comey did and precisely how he has been raked through the coals ever since, and I think rightly so.
So there was another point last night, Eli, that was really interesting. Giuliani appeared to a lot of folks to be threatening Robert Mueller. Let's listen to that part of it.
The real story here is not that this case isn't going to fizzle. It's going to blow up on them. The real question is what we talked about before. There's a lot more to what they did that nobody knows about yet. And Mueller is going to have a lot to answer for.
What do you make of that?
It's the typical projection that you hear from the president and the people around him all the time, and it's very vague. You'll find out the terrible things they did. I mean, if they had terrible things to say or allegations against the special counsel, they would just say them right now. But again, this is all sort of, again, for public consumption and trying to bias the public to believe that the probe is somehow out to get the president. And again, as Peter said, the special counsel's office doesn't comment on this stuff publicly. So you have Rudy and Jay Sekulow basically filling the airwaves and trying to sort of, respond in a political way to this legal matter. And that's been their strategy for a long time.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.